The Battle of Kursk of 1943. In mid-March 1943, the Eastern Front saw a significant operational pause due to troop exhaustion, combat losses on both sides, and the spring thaw turning the ground into a muddy quagmire. During this lull, both sides focused on learning from recent battles and rebuilding their forces for the upcoming summer campaign. The German army, in particular, needed to restore its panzer divisions, which had been decimated during Operation Blue, the defense of the Rjev salient, and the winter battles of 1942-43. By late January 1943, the situation was dire, with the German panzer arm reduced to just 510 operational tanks to counter the advancing Soviet forces. Since the start of Operation Barbarossa, the German army had lost over 7,500 tanks on the Eastern Front, far exceeding production levels. To address this crisis, Hitler appointed General Heinz Guderian as Inspector General of Panzer Forces in February 1943, granting him extensive powers. Guderian implemented measures to boost tank production, streamline manufacturing processes, and allocate newly produced long-barreled Stu-G3 assault guns to the panzer divisions. Despite these efforts, German tank numbers continued to decline, reaching an all-time low of 3,630 vehicles by late April 1943. However, in May and June, the situation began to improve, as increasing numbers of tanks and assault guns, with deliveries peaking at 988 vehicles in May, started to replenish the depleted mechanized divisions. With the panzer forces rapidly recovering, the German High Command, OKH, could plan renewed offensive actions on the Eastern Front for late spring and summer 1943. On March 13, 1943, the German High Command, OKH, initiated plans for a new offensive targeting the Kursk salient, dubbed Operation Citadel, with a projected start in early May. In the following weeks, OKH also considered additional operations, such as Habicht and Panther, aimed at pushing Soviet forces away from the industrial areas around the Donets River. The Kursk salient was chosen because it presented a prime opportunity for a geographically limited double envelopment operation, which the German army favored. The Soviet advance in February 1943, along with Manstein's successful recapture of Kharkov and Belgorod, had created this salient, a large bulge of Soviet-held territory extending westward into the German front lines. The Germans planned to launch two pincer movements from the northern and southern flanks of the salient, converging around the town of Kursk and further east at Tim. This encirclement aimed to trap significant Soviet forces in a Kesselschlacht, cauldron battle, a preferred German offensive tactic during World War II. Hitler decided to delay Operation Citadel to amass overwhelming strength instead of launching an immediate attack against the weary Soviet forces with the troops at hand. This decision reflected the German High Command's understanding of their army's reduced operational mobility and the errors made during the previous summer's Blue Offensive into the Caucasus. During that campaign, the Germans spread their combat power too thinly across a vast battlefield, leading to the catastrophe at Stalingrad and the hasty retreat from the Caucasus before the Maikop oil fields could benefit the Nazi war effort. Learning from these mistakes, the Germans confined Operation Citadel to a smaller geographical area, allowing for a more concentrated force at the critical point. The 2,950 tanks and assault guns deployed by the 17 mechanized divisions for Citadel nearly matched the number of armored vehicles used along the entire 1,248-kilometer, 900 miles, Eastern Front at the start of Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. The German armored forces included 528 Panzer II tanks with long-barreled 50mm guns, 631 Panzer IV models, FH, with long barrels, 200 new Panzer V Panthers, 131 Tiger heavy tanks, and 130 command vehicles, totaling 1,159 tanks. Additionally, these divisions had 193 assault guns, primarily long-barreled Stu G3s, and 90 new Ferdinand vehicles. To achieve this level of concentrated combat power, from mid-April to early July 1943, these leading mechanized divisions received significant reinforcements, including many of the latest German tanks in production. Among these were the new Panzer IV Model H tanks, which entered service in March 1943. Weighing 22.3 tons, 24.6 tons, the Model H featured a 75 mm and 3-in L48 gun, frontal armor up to 80 mm, 3.2 inches thick, and a top speed of 34 kph, 21 nm. It was also the first German tank to be routinely treated with Zimmerit paste, an anti-magnetic mine coating that looked like unevenly applied concrete. The influx of new armored vehicles was especially evident in General Paul Haus's 2 SS Panzer Corps, which had suffered heavy losses during Manstein's spring 1943 counter-offensive. The 3 elite divisions within this corps, SS Leibstandart, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, received 262 new armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, between late April and early July. This reinforcement increased their armored strength to 492 vehicles by the start of Operation Citadel. Despite this boost, the 3 key German Panzergrenadier divisions involved in the 1943 offensive could only field an average of 164 AFVs each. This highlighted the severe attritional damage inflicted by the Soviet offensives during the winter of 1942-43, despite Guderian's efforts to conserve and rebuild these resources. In hindsight, it is evident that Hitler's repeated postponements of Operation Citadel from April to late June 1943 to amass more of the new Panther medium tanks, Tiger Y heavy tanks, and Ferdinand's self-propelled guns had a detrimental effect on the operation's success. Hitler had high hopes that these advanced weapons would decisively break through Soviet defenses at Kursk. The German army had been taken aback in late 1941 when their panzers and anti-tank guns first faced the formidable Soviet T-34 medium tank, notably during the Battle of Mtsensk on October 6, 1941. This encounter led the OKH to begin developing a new medium tank in January 1942, which became the Panzer V Panther. The Panther incorporated many of the T-34's best features, such as wide tracks for better mobility, well-sloped armor for increased shot deflection, and a powerful long-barreled gun. The rushed production of the first pre-production Panther Model D tanks was completed in early 1943. These tanks, weighing 38.4 tons, 42.3 tons, were equipped with a powerful 75 mm 3-in L70 gun and featured well-sloped frontal armor up to 190 mm, 4.4 inches thick. However, the increased weight put excessive strain on the Maybach engine and transmission, leading to frequent mechanical issues and breakdowns. Despite Inspector General Guderian's awareness of these problems, Hitler's confidence in these wonder weapons prompted their deployment to the Eastern Front. By March 1, 1943, the German army had received its first 21 Panthers, and by the start of Operation Citadel on July 5th, an additional 179 had been delivered. These 200 Panthers were organized into a hastily formed independent armored brigade, with crews having had only limited training. The 51st and 52nd Tank Battalions, forming a brigade, participated in the southern pincer movement of the German offensive led by the 4th Panzer Army. Hitler's 6-week delay of Operation Citadel allowed an additional 179 Panthers and 30 newly produced Tiger II's heavy tanks to reach the front lines at Kursk, bringing the total number of Tigers to 131. The Tiger II, which had been introduced on the Eastern Front in late summer 1942, was a formidable weapon despite its lack of mobility. Weighing 49.8 tons, 55 tons, it was equipped with a powerful 88mm 3.45-inch gun and had armor up to 99 meters 3.9 inches thick. Operated by Germany's elite panzer units, the Tiger I was responsible for destroying numerous Soviet T-34 tanks during the Battle of Kursk. The last new German armored vehicle to make its debut at the Battle of Kursk, and one that Hitler had high hopes for, was the Panzerjäger Tiger P. Ferdinand SDKFZ 184. Around 90 Ferdinands were deployed at Kursk, serving in the independent 653rd and 654th Heavy Motorized Anti-Tank Battalions. This heavy tank destroyer was created from 90 discontinued Porsche prototype Tiger tank chassis, all produced in a single batch. The Ferdinand was armed with the formidable 88mm 3.45-in Pak 43-2 L71 gun, which was later used in the Tiger II heavy tank. Its superstructure was extremely heavily armored, with frontal plates up to 201mm 7.9 inches thick. To handle its immense weight of 60.7 tons, 66.9 tons, the Ferdinand was equipped with two Maybach 320 HP engines mounted in tandem. Despite this powerful setup, the vehicle's high ground pressure ratio, 20% greater than that of the Tiger II, severely limited its operational mobility, affecting its tactical effectiveness. Additionally, the Ferdinand lacked a machine gun for close defense, which meant it was designed to stay at the rear of the German armored wedge, providing lethal fire support from a distance. With the formidable strength of 421 modern armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, comprising 131 Tigers, 200 Panthers, and 90 Ferdinands, Hitler was confident that Operation Citadel would crush any Soviet resistance and reignite German success. However, among these three AFV models, it was the Tiger that played a pivotal role in the offensive. The 41 Tigers deployed by the elite divisions of Hausser II SS Panzer Corps consistently proved the devastating effectiveness of their 88mm 3.5-in guns. For instance, during 6 days of intense combat, a single Tiger from the 6th Panzer Company of the Das Reich Division managed to destroy approximately 24 enemy tanks. The German strategy of concentrating their forces at a decisive point was undermined by the Soviets' ability to predict their intentions. This allowed the Red Army to amass their reserves in the targeted areas, effectively countering the German buildup. By July 5, 1943, the Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts had created an extensive and powerful defensive network within the salient. This network consisted of numerous infantry strongpoints, forming an integrated anti-tank defense known as a pack front, dominated by the effective 76.2mm 3-in gun. The defenses included extensive foxholes, trenches and bunkers supported by dug-in T-34-76 tanks and concealed anti-tank and infantry support guns. These positions were interconnected by deep-dug field telephone wires and surrounded by dense minefields designed to funnel attackers into lethal killing zones where Soviet gunners could unleash devastating firepower. In addition to their formidable tactical defenses, the Soviets also established a robust operational defensive line along the Don River, anticipating the possibility that the Germans might break through their 7 defensive lines. This extensive defensive network was designed to halt any German advance, even if the initial defenses were breached. The Central and Voronezh fronts, excluding reserves held in depth, deployed a staggering 980,000 troops, supported by 19,000 guns and mortars, 520 Katyusha rocket launchers, and 3,300 armored fighting vehicles, AFVs. The bulk of these AFVs were T-34-76 tanks known for their mobility, strong armor, and powerful armament. Additionally, the Soviets fielded KV-1 heavy tanks, Su-76 and Su-122 assault guns, and T-70 light tanks for reconnaissance. Beyond these formidable forces, the Soviets had substantial reserves. The Central and Voronezh fronts could call upon an additional 380,000 troops and 600 AFVs. Furthermore, Konev's steppe front, held in deep reserve along the Don River, comprised 500,000 soldiers and 1,500 tanks. This massive concentration of Soviet forces ensured that any German breakthrough would be met with overwhelming resistance, making the task of the German offensive even more daunting. Given the overwhelming strength of the Soviet defenses, a rational assessment should have led to the cancellation of Operation Citadel. However, many German commanders, influenced by their belief in Aryan racial superiority, underestimated the Soviet fortifications. They assumed that the increased Soviet defenses would simply result in a larger encirclement and a more significant victory for the German forces. Moreover, the Germans were largely unaware of the extensive Soviet reserves positioned behind the salient. This lack of awareness was partly due to poor intelligence, but was primarily a result of the Soviets' effective use of maskirovka, their skillful concealment and deception tactics. Despite these challenges, the Germans proceeded with the offensive, confident in their racial superiority, tactical prowess, and the impact of their new armored fighting vehicles, AFVs. By July 5, 1943, the Soviets had established a formidable defensive network within the Kursk salient, including 7 defensive lines, extending up to 76 kilometers, 47 miles, in depth. The Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts, supported by extensive reserves, were well prepared to counter the German assault. The Soviets had also constructed an operational defensive line along the Don River, further strengthening their position. The German offensive faced a powerful enemy entrenched in prepared defenses, and it remained uncertain whether their perceived racial superiority, tactical skills, or advanced AFVs could secure the decisive victory Hitler anticipated. On July 4, 1943, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's Army Group South began its preparatory operations along the southern flank of the Kursk salient. These initial attacks at Gertsovka and Butovka aimed to secure advantageous starting positions for the main offensive, planned for the following morning. The Soviet defenses in this region were strategically positioned along several gentle ridges running west to east, intersected by rivers such as the Psel and northern Donets. Army Group South was divided into 2 main commands, Colonel General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army in the west and General Werner Kempf's Army Detachment, Kempf, in the east. Together, these commands fielded a formidable force of 6 panzer divisions, 4 panzer grenadier divisions, and 10 infantry divisions, along with an independent armored brigade of Panther tanks. This amounted to 349,000 troops and 5,014 armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, including 358 of the 6th and 31 long-barreled Panzer Vs, all 200 Panthers, and 102 of the 131 Tigers involved in Operation Citadel. The concentration of these armored strengths clearly indicated that the southern axis was the Schwerpunkt, or main point of effort, for the German offensive. Facing this powerful German force were General Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh Front, which comprised 466,000 troops and 1,700 AFVs. Additionally, the Voronezh Front had reserve formations totaling another 204,000 troops and 265 tanks. The terrain and strategic positioning of forces played a crucial role in the unfolding battle. The Soviets had established their defenses along natural barriers and fortified positions, making the German advance challenging. The initial skirmishes on July 4th were just the beginning of what would become one of the largest and most intense battles of World War II. At 05:30 hours on July 5, 1943, Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, launched its assault on the northern flank of the Kursk salient. The initial attack was spearheaded by General Walter Model's 9th Army, which included 1 armored and 9 infantry divisions. This force struck along a 63-kilometer, 39-mile front against the first Soviet defensive line, held by General Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front. Model kept 5 additional mechanized divisions in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthroughs in the early days of combat. The Soviet defensive positions were strategically placed along the ridges north of the Svarpa Valley, particularly between the villages of Muravli in the west and Maloarkhangelsk in the east. Model's 9th Army was a formidable force, comprising 6 panzer divisions, 14 infantry divisions, and an independent battalion of Tiger tanks. This amounted to 335,000 troops and 1,009 armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, including 273 Panzer Vs, 32 Tigers, and all 90 Ferdinands. These forces were organized into 4 corps, including the elite XLI and X-Elephant Panzer Corps. Facing this German onslaught were the 114,000 troops of the Soviet 13th Army and the 96,000 troops of the 70th Army. Additionally, Rokossovsky had deployed another 15,000 troops with 840 AFVs on either flank and behind the front lines, along with 185,000 soldiers and 390 tanks held in reserve. The terrain and strategic positioning of forces played a crucial role in the unfolding battle. The Soviets had established their defenses along natural barriers and fortified positions, making the German advance challenging. The initial skirmishes on July 5th were just the beginning of what would become one of the largest and most intense battles of World War II. As Model's forces were assembling in the early hours of July 5th, they were hit by a fierce 40-minute Soviet artillery bombardment that significantly disrupted their positions and forward attack plans. Soviet intelligence, which had become increasingly effective as the war progressed, had uncovered the timing of the German offensive. Consequently, Rokossovsky launched a preemptive bombardment to spoil the German attack. Despite this setback, Model's 10 spearhead divisions initiated a powerful assault, supported by relentless Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber strikes. However, the German divisions encountered intense resistance from Soviet strongpoints. Many German tanks fell victim to the extensively sown anti-tank mines, the formidable 76.2mm, 3-inch anti-tank guns, and Soviet air attacks. To regain momentum, Model committed 2 of his reserve panzer divisions to the battle raging between Gnilets and Maloarkhangelsk. Despite repeated attacks by powerful forces and frequent airstrikes, Model's 9th Army made painfully slow progress. By nightfall, the Germans had advanced only a maximum of 10 kilometers, 6 miles, into the Soviet defenses around Bobriki. In other sectors of the 40-kilometer, 25-mile front, German progress was limited to just 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles, as seen at Alexandrovka. Following Army Group South's preliminary attacks on the afternoon of July 4th, engineers worked through the night to silently clear paths in the enemy minefields, allowing the panzers to advance the next morning. Early on July 5th, in the western sector, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army launched an attack along a 40-kilometer, 25-mile front. Further east, Kempf's forces struck northeast to cover the right flank of Army Detachment Hoth's advance. Both formations smashed into the positions held by the 80,000 troops of Lieutenant General I.M. Chistyakov's 6th Guards Army, which were supported by 155 armored fighting vehicles, AFVs, 92 Katyusha rocket launchers, and 1,780 artillery pieces. In Hoth's sector, General von Knobelsdorff's Ixl-Vieh Panzer Corps, backed by the Panthers of the 10th Panzer Brigade, attacked from northwest of Tomarovka towards Cherkasskoye and Kazatskoye. To the immediate east, the powerful Tsi SS Panzer Corps, with 492 AFVs, including 42 Tigers, thrust from northeast of Tomarovka towards Rakovo and Yakovlevo. This coordinated assault was part of the larger Operation Citadel, the German offensive aimed at encircling and destroying Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. Despite the initial success in breaching the first line of Soviet defenses, the Germans faced fierce resistance and well-prepared defensive positions, which would lead to one of the largest and most brutal tank battles in history. In the XLVI Panzer Corps sector, the formidable Grossdeutschland Division formed an armored wedge and, following an artillery barrage, advanced towards Cherkasskoye and Luchanino. Their goal for the day was to capture the village of Suzewo on the River Pina, about 10 kilometers, 6 miles away. A company commander in the Grossdeutschland Division's tank regiment recalled that the initial German advance towards Cherkasskoye was promising. However, the Soviets had strategically withdrawn from the nearby village to lure the German tanks, including the Panthers of the 10th Panzer Brigade, into dense minefields to the north. As the Grossdeutschland Division's tanks became entangled in the minefields, they were subjected to intense fire from well-camouflaged Soviet 76.2 meters and 3-inch, anti-tank guns, pre-registered artillery, and Ilyushin Il-2 fighter-bomber strikes. Within an hour, 36 Panthers were immobilized or destroyed in the cornfields around the village. Despite this setback, Knobelsdorff's 3 Panzer divisions, with Tigers or Panthers leading where available, launched repeated attacks and slowly advanced throughout July 5th, facing fierce resistance. By evening, the Exawara Panzer Corps had pushed a maximum of 8 kilometers, 5 miles, into the Soviet defenses, breaching their first line in several locations. Under Knobelsdorff's command, the 3 divisions of the Dieck SS Panzer Corps formed armored wedges and launched a coordinated assault to the north and northeast. To the west, the Leibstandarte Division advanced towards Yakovlevo. In the center, the Das Reich Division moved towards Luchki, and in the east, the Totenkopf Division pushed towards Gostischewo. Each division's organic Tiger company led these armored wedges, with lighter Panzer III and IV tanks, as well as assault guns, positioned behind and on the flanks. Following them were the Panzer Grenadiers in their half-tracked APCs and lorries. Throughout the day, the determined SS troops battled through successive, strongly fortified enemy positions and anti-tank defenses, significantly aided by continuous airstrikes and the formidable firepower of their Tigers. By the end of the day, the Dieck SS Panzer Corps had advanced 20 kilometers, 12 miles, reaching the second Soviet defense line around Luchki. This marked the furthest single German advance during the entire Citadel offensive. Further to the east, beyond the Donets River, the attack mounted by Army Detachment Kempf to protect the vulnerable eastern flank of the Dieck SS Panzer Corps made less promising progress. General Breith's 3rd Panzer Corps assaulted the 1st Soviet defense line, which was manned by the left flank of the 69th Army and the 76,800 troops of the 7th Guards Army. 4 of Kempf's divisions attempted to cross the northern Donets River, while a 5th division struck from a small bridgehead already established at Mikhailovka near Belgorod. The 68th Infantry Division failed to penetrate the powerful initial Soviet defenses beyond Mikhailovka, prompting Kempf to divert the 6th Panzer Division further south, where initial progress seemed more promising. In this southern location, the 7th and 19th Panzer Divisions, supported by the 45 Tigers, of the 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion managed to advance up to 6 kilometers, 4 miles, despite the terrain favoring the defenders. The overall progress of Army Detachment Kempf was hindered by the strong Soviet resistance and challenging terrain, which significantly slowed their advance compared to the more successful operations of the 2 SS Panzer Corps. On July 6th, Model's divisions launched a powerful offensive in the north against the 2nd Soviet defensive line, aiming to capture the key village of Ponyri and the strategic Olkovatka Ridge. From these positions, Model intended to advance rapidly towards Kursk, utilizing the more favorable tank terrain of the open plain to the south. To counter this move, Rokossovsky deployed reserves overnight. At dawn on July 7th, an armored strike force from the 16th Tank Corps launched a counterattack against the German units north of Soborovka, pushing them back. The arrival of the 2nd Panzer Division, supported by the Tigers of the 505th Battalion, managed to halt and repel the fierce Soviet counteroffensive. With the support of intensive Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, the Germans mounted repeated combined arms attacks towards Olkovatka and Ponyri throughout the day. Despite facing desperate Soviet resistance, bolstered by intense artillery and aerial support, the Germans advanced just 2 kilometers, about 1¼ miles, to the outskirts of Ponyri, near Hill 253.3. Throughout the day, repeated Soviet counterattacks temporarily halted the German advance and, on several occasions, forced them to retreat. The intense fighting demonstrated the resilience and determination of both sides in this critical phase of the Battle of Kursk. Over the next 3 days, intense combat ensued, as both sides committed additional reserves. The Germans made repeated attempts to capture Ponyri, but faced continuous Soviet counterattacks. The fierce fighting in the village resembled the brutal urban combat of Stalingrad in 1942, with prolonged battles for individual buildings. The determined Soviet defense, supported by relentless Katyusha rocket fire and constant Il-2 fighter-bomber attacks, prevented the Germans from capturing more than the northern half of the village. On July 10th and 11th, Rokossovsky launched powerful counter-thrusts that halted the exhausted and heavily depleted German forces. After 7 days of intense combat, the German northern thrust had advanced only 16 kilometers, 10 miles. On July 12th, Rokossovsky initiated even larger counterattacks, pushing the Germans back towards their original positions from July 5th. Despite 8 days of fierce fighting and 20,700 casualties, Model's northern pincer failed due to the staunch resistance of the Central Front. The intense combat highlighted the resilience and determination of the Soviet forces, ultimately thwarting the German offensive in this sector of the Battle of Kursk. On July 6th, the Ixlay Panzer Corps, with the support of over 200 Luftwaffe sorties, continued to push the beleaguered Soviet 6th Guards Army back to the 2nd Soviet defense line south of Oboyan, capturing Rakovo in the process. However, the advance of the 3 German armored divisions was once again slowed by fierce counterattacks from the Soviet 27th Army, which had been moved up from the Voronezh Front's reserve echelon. Further east, Hauser's the 2 SS Panzer Corps successfully pushed back elements of the weakened 6th Guards Army towards Prokhorovka. The Tiger-led armored wedge of the Leibstandarte Division secured a long and narrow penetration, advancing another 8 kilometers, 5 miles, to close in on Titarovino. Meanwhile, Army Detachment Kempf's 3 panzer divisions, supported by its Tiger Battalion, managed to push out of their bridgehead over the northern Donets River and drive the Soviets back up to 8 kilometers, 5 miles, towards Melikovo. Over the next 4 days, the Ixl Thies and the 2 SS Panzer Corps made a slow but steady advance north towards Oboyan and northeast towards Prokhorovka, despite facing intense Soviet resistance. Batutin's Voronezh front kept up the pressure by continuously sending fresh reserves into the fray. On July 7th, Knobelsdorff's X-5th Panzer Corps managed to break through at Syrzevo, but their progress was once again hampered by fierce Soviet counterattacks. Meanwhile, the Dessetten SS Panzer Corps also faced tough opposition, making only gradual progress. Near Syokny, a Soviet battle group consisting of 50 T-34 tanks, supported by infantry and artillery, launched a bold counterattack against Haus's advancing forces. The Tigers of the 13th Tank Company, Leibstandarte Division, bore the brunt of this fierce assault as they led the armoured wedge forward. Major Staudegger orchestrated a desperate defence against the Soviet onslaught. His formidable Tiger tanks, with their devastating 88mm cannons, held the advancing Red Army armour at bay. Meanwhile, daring SS combat engineers, overlooked by the enemy's push, emerged from their hidden positions. Amidst the chaos of battle, these brave men laid a treacherous trap. Teller anti-tank mines were carefully placed behind the Soviet lines, cutting off their retreat. The Tigers' precision fire exacted a heavy toll, destroying 16 enemy vehicles before the Soviets withdrew under a protective smokescreen. However, their ordeal was far from over. As the T-34s attempted to fall back, 7 more fell victim to the cleverly placed minefield. Though exhausted, the men of the Leibstandarte Division steeled themselves for the next phase of their advance towards Prokhorovka, their resolve unbroken by the fierce engagement. On July 10th, the X-5th Panzer Corps launched a diversionary attack from Novosilovka along the Belgorod-Oboyan road. Their objective, to draw Soviet reserves away from the main thrust. This maneuver set the stage for a joint offensive by the 2 SS and 2 Panzer Corps, aimed at breaking through to Prokhorovka and penetrating deep into Soviet territory. The following day saw a significant breakthrough. The combined forces of 2 SS and 2 Panzer Corps shattered the 3rd Soviet defensive line, creating a 23-kilometer gap between Storozhevo and Kazachye. Spearheading this assault, the 3 SS divisions advanced to within 5 kilometers of Prokhorovka. This northeastern drive benefited greatly from overwhelming air support. The Luftwaffe concentrated its tactical air power on the Tatars SS Panzer Corps' advance, with Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Henschel H's 129 ground attack aircraft pounding Soviet positions relentlessly. This coordinated land and air offensive represented a critical moment in the battle's progression. On July 12, 1943, the southern shoulder of Operation Citadel witnessed its pivotal moment, a confrontation that would become etched in German memory as the death ride of 4th Panzer Army. At Prokhorovka, history's largest tank battle unfolded as 700 Soviet armored vehicles clashed with 500 German AFVs in a series of brutal engagements. 2 days prior, General Batutin, commander of the Voronezh front, had anticipated the impending German thrust towards Prokhorovka. Recognizing the strategic implications, he made a decisive move. Batutin redeployed Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov's elite 5th Guards Tank Army, a force of 40,000 troops and 500 tanks, to reinforce General M.M. Popov's 2 Tank Corps north of Prokhorovka. This concentration of Soviet armor set the stage for a monumental collision of mechanized forces. The ensuing battle would not only determine the fate of Prokhorovka, but also shape the outcome of Operation Citadel itself. As both sides committed their armored reserves, the fields around this small Russian town were about to become the arena for one of World War II's most intense and consequential tank battles. On the morning of July 12th, General Vatutin set in motion a decisive counterstroke. He ordered Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, reinforced by elements of the 5th Guards Army and 1st Tank Army, to launch a massive assault against the advancing 2 SS Panzer Corps. Simultaneously, a portion of Rotmistrov's force was dispatched southward to confront Bryth's 3rd Panzer Corps, which had made alarming progress towards Rzhavets, mere kilometers from Prokhorovka. Rotmistrov, having analyzed reports on the formidable German Tigers and Ferdinands, devised a daring strategy. He aimed to nullify the enemy's superior long-range firepower by exploiting the T-34's agility, closing to point-blank range or striking from the flanks. As dawn broke on that sweltering, overcast day, 550 Soviet tanks, supported by infantry and artillery, surged towards the SS armored spearheads. The Tigers opened fire at distance, but the T-34s rapidly closed the gap, kicking up enormous dust clouds that reduced visibility to mere meters. What ensued was a chaotic, close-quarters armored melee. Hundreds of tanks clashed in a series of frenzied encounters, often engaging at ranges under 100 meters. The battlefield became an inferno of steel and fire, with the desperate struggle continuing through the day and into the following morning. This pivotal engagement, unfolding amid smoke, dust, and confusion, would prove to be a crucial moment in the larger Operation Citadel, testing the mettle of both German and Soviet forces in one of the war's most intense armored confrontations. After 36 hours of relentless combat, the Soviet armored counter-offensive had achieved its primary objective, halting the German advance northeast. On paper, the engagement appeared to favor the Germans, who claimed the destruction of 450 enemy tanks while losing only 150 of their own. However, this numerical advantage belied the true strategic outcome of Prokhorovka. Rotmistrov's aggressive counterstrike had not only blunted Hauser's drive through Prokhorovka, but also stripped Manstein's forces along the southern shoulder of their remaining operational momentum. The German offensive had lost its teeth. By July 13th, Operation Citadel had devolved into a grueling war of attrition, a stalemate that served no strategic purpose for the already overstretched German army. Moreover, the seeming disparity in tank losses masked a crucial reality. The Soviet Union's superior industrial capacity meant it could more readily replace its armored losses, while every German tank destroyed represented an increasingly irreplaceable asset. In essence, Prokhorovka marked a turning point. Though not a clear-cut tactical defeat, it signaled the operational failure of Citadel and foreshadowed the shifting tide of the war on the Eastern Front. The Germans had expended their offensive strength without achieving a decisive breakthrough, setting the stage for the inexorable Soviet advance that would follow. On July 10, 1943, the German High Command faced a critical juncture. As the Battle of Kursk unfolded with increasing complexity, news arrived of the Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. This development posed a grave threat to the Axis' southern flank, compounding the challenges faced on the Eastern Front. The setback at Prokhorovka only served to reinforce Hitler's growing doubts about Operation Citadel's potential for decisive success. In a significant strategic shift, the Führer decided to redeploy part of Hauser's politically reliable in 2 SS Panzer Corps to Italy, hoping to shore up the wavering resolve of Germany's Italian allies. Faced with mounting pressures, including a recent Soviet offensive along the Mius River front in Ukraine, Hitler made the fateful decision to cancel Operation Citadel. This move aimed to free up vital panzer resources for both the Italian theater and the beleaguered Eastern Front. In the aftermath of this decision, Manstein's forces executed a gradual fighting withdrawal to their original positions along the southern shoulder, all while under intense Soviet pressure. The southern pincer of Citadel had proven nearly as disastrous as Model's northern thrust. Operation Citadel exacted a staggering toll on the German war machine, costing approximately 54,000 irreplaceable troops and 900 vital armored fighting vehicles. Yet for this steep price, the Wehrmacht gained nothing but fleeting, inconsequential territorial advances, a strategic void that yielded no meaningful operational advantages. More critically, this ill-fated offensive marked a decisive shift in the war's momentum. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, once firmly in German hands, now irrevocably passed to the Soviet Union. While the Battle of Stalingrad is often cited as the war's turning point, a strong argument can be made that Citadel's failure truly represents this pivotal moment in the 1941-45 Eastern Front campaign. By squandering the armored reserves so painstakingly accumulated by Guderian in a futile war of attrition against a well-prepared and numerically superior foe, the German High Command had committed a grave strategic blunder. They now faced an adversary whose strength had reached unprecedented levels. The stark disparity in forces told its own story. The German army in the east, along with its Axis allies, could muster just over 3.2 million soldiers and 2,400 armored vehicles. In stark contrast, the Red Army now fielded a colossal force of 5.8 million troops supported by 7,900 tanks. This immense imbalance in manpower and materiel foreshadowed the titanic struggles to come as the tide of war inexorably turned against the Third Reich. The outcome of the Kursk offensive presents a perplexing paradox. Given that the Germans had the luxury of selecting the battlefield, devising their strategy, and timing their attack, the operation's failure becomes even more remarkable. This unexpected result serves as a stark indicator of the dramatic shift in the war's dynamics since the summer of 1941. On one hand, it highlights the Soviet Union's remarkable evolution in both strategic planning and tactical execution. The Red Army, once caught off guard and overwhelmed, had transformed into a formidable fighting force, capable of not just withstanding but thwarting a major German offensive. Conversely, it exposes the erosion of German military prowess. The Wehrmacht, once synonymous with swift, decisive victories, now found itself unable to achieve breakthrough even under seemingly favorable conditions. A critical factor in this reversal of fortunes lay in the Germans' misplaced faith in their new armored vehicles. The much-vaunted Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers, far from being the game-changers they were envisioned to be, proved to be spectacular failures on the battlefield. The Panthers, in particular, were plagued by a host of issues. Their excessive weight led to frequent mechanical breakdowns, while a design quirk intended for amphibious capabilities, ultimately unnecessary at Kursk, resulted in poor ventilation and recurrent engine fires. The operational toll was severe. By the third day of battle, a mere 38 out of 200 deployed Panthers remained combat-ready. This debacle at Kursk not only signaled the end of German offensive capabilities on the Eastern Front, but also foreshadowed the technological and industrial challenges that would hamper the Wehrmacht for the remainder of the war. The failure of these new weapons systems, coupled with the inability to exploit chosen favorable conditions, marked a turning point from which the German war machine would never recover. The Battle of Kursk exposed critical weaknesses in Germany's new armored vehicles, epitomized by the Ferdinand tank destroyer's disastrous debut. Burdened by excessive weight, 21 Ferdinands succumbed to mechanical failures within the operation's first 4 days. Compounding this issue, a severe shortage of spare parts left many more immobilized, unable to be repaired, and returned to the fight. Perhaps most glaringly, the Ferdinand's design overlooked a crucial element. The absence of a machine gun left it vulnerable to infantry assault. This oversight proved catastrophic. Soviet soldiers, demonstrating remarkable adaptability, exploited this weakness. In the battle's initial 6 days, they neutralized 22 Ferdinands using a combination of demolition charges, mines, and improvised explosive devices. The mighty German machines, isolated from their supporting infantry, became little more than stationary targets. However, to attribute Citadel's failure solely to equipment malfunctions would be an oversimplification. The operation was fundamentally flawed from its very conception. By choosing such an obvious target for their offensive, the Germans sacrificed the element of surprise, a critical factor in their earlier successful campaigns like Operation Barbarossa and Operation Blue. Hitler's decision to delay the attack further compounded these strategic missteps. A swifter assault in early May, even with fewer forces, might have yielded better results than the more robust but delayed offensive of July 5th. This postponement afforded the Soviets precious time to fortify their defenses, transforming the Kursk salient into a formidable fortress. In retrospect, the Germans' most critical error lay not in the execution of Operation Citadel, but in the decision to proceed with it at all. Given the unfavorable tactical realities they faced, cancelling the offensive might have been the wisest course of action. A strategy of flexible defense, utilizing the rebuilt armored divisions as a mobile reserve to counter the inevitable Soviet offensive, could have yielded far greater success than the meager gains Citadel ultimately achieved. The persistence with this ill-fated offensive reveals a deeper, more insidious problem within the German High Command: the growing influence of ideology over strategic reasoning. As the tide of war turned against them in the East, German leadership increasingly leaned on notions of racial superiority to bolster troop morale and resolve. This ideological lens, however, blinded them to the rapid and significant improvements in Soviet military capabilities between 1942 and 1943. This cognitive dissonance, the inability to reconcile their presumed superiority with the evolving reality on the ground, led to a severe underestimation of their adversary. The Germans failed to recognize that they were no longer facing the same Red Army they had nearly crushed in 1941. Instead, they confronted a reinvigorated force, one that had learned harsh lessons and adapted accordingly. As the German Ninth Army under model found itself mired in the bloodbath around Ponieri on July 12, 1943, the strategic landscape of the Eastern Front underwent a dramatic shift. General Sokolovsky's Western Front, poised and waiting, unleashed a powerful offensive that would become known as Operation Kutuzov. This Soviet thrust targeted the 2nd Panzer Army, which held the northeastern flank of the German salient. The timing was impeccable. The Germans, their attention fixated on the brutal struggle within the Kursk salient, were caught off guard by this sudden assault on their periphery. Operation Kutuzov exemplified the evolution of Soviet strategic thinking. Gone were the days of headlong, costly frontal assaults. Instead, the Red Army had adopted a more nuanced approach. They had patiently allowed the Germans to exhaust themselves against the formidable defenses of the salient, wearing down their combat power. Only then did they strike, targeting the comparatively weaker enemy flanking positions. This sophisticated strategy paid immediate dividends. The Soviet offensive tore through the weakened German defensive lines with alarming speed, driving westward with increasing momentum. This rapid advance posed a grave threat to Model's Ninth Army, still locked in desperate defensive battles along the northern shoulder of the salient. The very lifelines of the Ninth Army, its vital communication and supply routes, now lay in jeopardy. Operation Kutuzov thus represented more than just another offensive. It signaled the maturation of Soviet operational art. By exploiting the Germans' focus on the Kursk salient, the Soviets had created a dangerous new front, one that threatened to unravel the entire German position in the region. This masterstroke not only relieved pressure on the defenders of Kursk, but also set the stage for a wider Soviet counteroffensive that would push the Wehrmacht ever westward. In late July, following initial successes, General Popov's Bryansk front launched an offensive from south of Mtsensk towards Oral. After a week of consistent progress, Popov's forces captured Oral, a crucial road and rail hub in the region. Building on this momentum, the Soviets pushed westward over a 122 kilometers and a 76-mile front. By mid-August, this advance compelled the Germans to retreat from the northern shoulder, falling back to the pre-prepared defenses of the Hagen Line, located 121 kilometers, 75 miles, west of the Soviets' starting positions. Meanwhile, a more significant setback awaited the German forces south of Kursk. On August 3rd, the battered German troops were taken by surprise when General Konev's Steppe Front and General Vatutin's Voronezh Front launched their own offensive, code-named Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev. The operation aimed to collapse the entire German shoulder of the salient and recapture the vital communication hubs of Belgorod and Kharkov. For this operation, General Konev's Steppe Front mobilized 194,000 troops organized into 3 combined arms rifle armies, supported by 460 tanks and 4,100 artillery pieces or mortars. The more powerful Voronezh Front, under General Vatutin, deployed 458,000 soldiers across 2 elite spearhead tank armies and 5 combined arms armies. Vatutin's forces were further strengthened by 1,930 tanks, many of which were T-34s, and 8,050 guns. Stavka's strategy was to break through the German tactical defense zone with 4 combined arms armies. Once the battle became more dynamic, they planned to deploy the 2 elite Guards tank armies for a rapid exploitation thrust deep into the German rear, with the objective of capturing Kharkov. Kharkov was not only the key administrative center of Axis-occupied Ukraine, but also a vital transport hub that controlled the entire German position in this sector of the Eastern Front. As early as June 1943, the Soviets had already envisioned their halting of Operation Citadel and their own Kutuzov offensive as parts of a larger, coordinated strategy. This strategy involved a series of offensives, meticulously timed and spatially coordinated, known as the strategy of successive operations. The Rumyantsev offensive was the next step in this expanding sequence of attacks. Its success would pave the way for a major offensive across the central and southern sectors of the Eastern Front. The ultimate goal was to push the Germans back beyond the Dnieper River within 5 months. These synchronized and integrated offensives, guided by the doctrine of deep operations and effective operational art, would eventually involve up to 2.8 million soldiers organized under 7 front commands. In early August, the Rumyantsev offensive took the Germans by surprise. The Voronezh and Steppe fronts had suffered significant damage during the Kursk offensive, especially at Prokhorovka, leading the Germans to believe that the Soviets wouldn't be able to launch another offensive until late August at the earliest. However, driven by Stalin's relentless demands, the Soviets made a concerted effort to rebuild their combat strength quickly. This allowed them to strike earlier than expected, catching the German forces off guard before they could recover from the heavy losses sustained during Operation Citadel. The German forces, consisting of Army Detachment Kempf and Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, were only able to muster 204,000 troops and 340 operational panzers and assault guns to face the onslaught of approximately 652,000 Soviet soldiers. Caught off guard and heavily outnumbered, the Germans' defensive positions quickly crumbled under the relentless assault of the Red Army. On August 3rd and 4th, Soviet rifle divisions swiftly captured Belgorod and continued their advance southwest towards Bogodukov and Kharkov. In mid-August, the Germans attempted to counterattack with armored units from the Akhturka bridgehead, temporarily slowing the Soviet advance. Despite these efforts, Kharkov fell on August 21st, marking the fourth and final time the city changed hands since the start of Operation Barbarossa. As Operation Rumyantsev progressed, Rokossovsky's Central Front launched an offensive from Kursk, connecting with the ongoing operations in the Nevel-Oral sector and extending southward. At the same time, the southwestern and southern fronts attacked Army Group South in the Izum-Taganrog area. By late August, the Soviets had initiated a broad strategic counter-offensive aimed at pushing the Germans back to the Dnieper River, which Hitler had designated as the Eastern Rampart defense line. Facing diminishing mobility and combat effectiveness, the German army in the autumn of 1943 increasingly relied on static defense rather than the flexible strategies previously advocated. In mid-September 1943, the Soviet advance compelled Army Group South to retreat across the Dnieper River to avoid being trapped by Soviet forces. Despite this, on September 23rd, a Soviet unit managed to establish a bridgehead at Veliki Bukrin. By late September, Soviet troops had reached the Dnieper from Gomel in the north to Zaporozhye in the south. On October 9th, Tolbukin's Southern Front, later known as the 4th Ukrainian Front, launched an attack on Kleist's Army Group A at Melitopol on the Sea of Azov. By October 25th, Soviet forces had advanced rapidly to Perekop, isolating the German 17th Army in Crimea. Concurrently, Konev's Steppe Front, soon renamed the 2nd Ukrainian Front, launched an offensive from its bridgehead west of the Dnieper between Dnepropetrovsk and Kremenchug. Between October 18th and 25th, Konev's forces pushed southwest to the outskirts of Krivoy Rog, a crucial transportation hub for Nikopol and Zaporozhye. However, swift counterattacks by Manstein's XL Panzer Corps from October 27th to 29th managed to halt the Soviet advance and inflicted heavy losses on 2 Soviet mechanized corps. On November 3rd, Vatutin's troops launched a powerful assault from their bridgehead at Lyutezh, swiftly recapturing Kiev within 48 hours. This alarming development prompted Manstein to respond decisively by redeploying the XL-Feet Panzer Corps to Berdichev on November 14th to counter Vatutin's advancing armor. By November 22nd, the XL-8 Panzer Corps had pushed 129 kilometers, 80 miles, eastward, retaking Zhytomyr and decimating the overextended 3rd Guards Tank Army. Despite these localized victories, aided by adverse weather conditions, the German forces could only slow the Soviet advance westward in late November, not halt it. By mid-December, the Germans retained control of only a few small sections of the western bank of the Dnieper, south of Kiev. However, just as the Soviet offensive seemed to lose momentum, they launched a new assault on December 23rd, aiming to drive the Axis forces out of western Ukraine entirely.